I'll start out here, and I've got a tape measure, a ruler for marking, like a rotary type ruler, and a Mark Be Gone marker, and my 4-in-1 machine quilting ruler. I'll start out, the first thing that I'm going to do, you can see here, using my measuring tape, I'm going to measure across the inside of that top border. Now, this is something I would do on any quilt, but the measurements that I'm going to give you and the increments that I'm going to give you are based off of the panel size, the smaller size, the 51 by 60 inch panel. So the first thing that I did was measure across. The inside of that outside border is 31 inches. So what I am going to do, and this is how I do it with all border designs, I will figure out, okay, from 31, what is a good divisible number? So what does that mean? Well, I have a total of 31 inches. 7 divides into 28 very nicely 4 times. So if I do that, I'm going to have 3 extra inches, 21 or 28 out of 31. I'm going to have a few extra inches, 3 inches total on each side. So I'll use that extra 1.5 inches on each end to create my corners. So measuring in 1.5 inches, I'll mark my first increment. From there, I'm going to mark 4 sections that are 7 inches. So I'll mark increments every 7 inches along the top of that border and also along the side. Once I've marked those 7-inch increments, then I'm going to find the center of each of those 4 7-inch increments. So it's going to be 3.5 inches. From there, you could see that I was laying my 4-in-1 machine quilting ruler on there to kind of gauge and see about how big I would like my scallop to be. I chose to make this scallop 4.5 inches tall. So the center of each of those 3.5 inch points, I'm going to draw a straight line up to the top, marking a straight line that's 4.5 inches up on the center point. I'll do that along all of those. When I get to the corners, now I'm going to line my machine quilting ruler up and create a 45-degree angle marking. So that marking, I'm just going to draw a straight line out. Then along that marking, I will mark another marking at the end of it at the 4.5 inch increment. I'll do this on all corners. Now, when it comes to the side, obviously on this sampler here, I do not have a full side or a bottom that goes all the way down. If this were a regular quilt, because I had decided on 7-inch wide scallops that are 4.5 inches tall, I'll measure along the side. And if it's not an increment that's divisible by 7, I will find a divisible increment that's as close to 7 as can be. So sometimes on the sides, my scallops may end up being 8 inches, and I am okay with that. If they are consistent, I don't want to do something that's maybe like 9, but I would figure something close to what I've got going on the top. After I've marked all those straight points, now I'm going to get the 4-in-1 machine quilting ruler, and I'm actually going to mark all of the scallops on this one. Now, regular quilts, when I'm quilting, I don't always go through and mark every single increment, but this is a point, especially when you're starting out stitching the scallops, where I would actually recommend marking out these first lines, just so you'll know what it's going to look like, what you're actually stitching out, where you'll want to stitch. It's just a really good thing. Like I said, I'm using the blue Mark Be Gone marker to do all of my markings on this quilt. Once I've marked that curved line going up to the point and then another curved line on the opposite side all the way across, then I'm actually going to add another curved line. This is going to be just a point-to-point scallop through the bottom center of each of those scallops. When I come to the corners, obviously it's a little bit different shape. It's not the exact same curve because it's a corner. So I'm just going to stitch a small line that goes up 1/2 inch from the bottom. So just a simple curve from the bottom to that center marked line and then back to the opposite corner. And I will show you how I stitched that out. So here's a simple image of that scallop design, just the markings that I've done. Now, obviously I'm going to add a lot more detail to this, but when I'm marking, this is the foundation that I'll mark, and then I can always add to this. Having a nice foundation and knowing what you're going to do is really a big part of machine quilting scallops. On this scallop border design, I will actually use my 4-in-1 and my inside out machine quilting ruler. Most of this design you would be okay stitching out with just one of the rulers, but there are parts here where you'll see that it's a lot easier to switch back and forth and use both rulers. So anytime I'm stitching out a scallop border design, because I am quilting on the long arm machine, now obviously you can quilt all these designs out on a domestic machine and you could work all the way around. So on a long arm, you can only work with what fits in your throat space. So I start quilting on the left side of the quilt as far down as my throat space will allow me. From there, I'm going to stitch along those marked lines that I've marked already. Now, if I hadn't marked those and I just marked reference points, this is the point where I would just stitch, holding my ruler, lining it up so that I can stitch point to reference point. I'll continue stitching all the way across that first set of the largest scalloped lines. Now, once I get all the way to the bottom point on the right side of the block, this is a place where you could stop, cut your threads, and move across the block or across the design to the left and then come back to the right. With this particular one, I decided because it is a smaller one, I'll just stitch from the right to the left. So now I'm working my way back across the quilt and stitching on that smaller inside scallop design. Notice as I do get to my corners that I'm lining that first marked line on my 4-in-1 machine quilting ruler right up with the corner, that white inside corner when I get to the corner. By lining it up right along that corner, it makes it so I didn't have to add that extra marking in there, and I can stitch a smaller kind of inside scallop on my corners that moves in about a ½ inch. Once I reach that bottom point, now that I've worked my way all the way back across, now I'm going to go through and add an echo line to the outside of my largest scallop. Now, adding an echo line is something that you're going to see me do quite often. I like to add that nice echo line to the outside as a place for my eye to rest. By stitching that and having that little echo line, now I can add a filler to the inside of the scallop and also to the outside of the scallop. And it makes it so the designs are just kind of separated from each other. If I stitched a heavy filler on the outside and then something heavy on the inside, it's almost going to disappear. It's going to kind of feel like I lose my scallop design. So adding this little echo to the outside really does make a great impact. So you can see that obviously I'm using my machine quilting ruler and I'm lining the outside of my ruler up right on top of my previous stitch line. By lining it up right on top of my previous stitch line, it makes it so I have a nice consistent 1/4 inch spacing from my previous stitch line to the new stitch line. Now, if I did want a little bit wider spacing or I wanted to adjust things like this, I could always move down and use one of the markings on the top side of the 4-in-1 machine quilting ruler. If I lined it up with that first one, I would end up with more like a ½ inch spacing around that outside. Personally, I am a heavy quilter and like heavy quilting, so I like, especially for this design, the smaller spacing in there. Now that I've completed that echo scallop, I'm going to move back across the block, and this time I'm going to fill in the largest space on my scallop, so it's kind of the space in the top, with a fun swirl design. So as I stitch out this swirl, the things that I am thinking about, leaving myself an out. So I stitch a swirl, then when I get to the center, I'll take a brief pause, change directions, and stitch back out. Always thinking ahead and leaving myself an out. This is a place where you could quilt any type of filler that you wanted, I just think it's fun to add a little swirl in here because on the outside, I'm going to go with straight line quilting. By doing the straight line quilting on the outside that I'll show you in a minute, it creates enough contrast that the scallop here really becomes the focal. It becomes what your eye is drawn to. The swirls then kind of become a secondary design, and those straight lines that we'll do in the background filler will almost seem to disappear. I love the contrast that you can create by using scallops and swirls or something soft and swirly and the straight lines on the outside. After I've stitched that first one, then I'm going to switch rulers and move to my inside out machine quilting ruler. Now with the inside out machine quilting ruler, I'm going to stitch an inside echo along the inside of the smallest scallop. When I've stitched that inside echo, when I get to the bottom, then I'll travel along the ditch. So I'm stitching in my ditch. You know I love the look of stitch in the ditch, moving to the next scallop. When I get to the next scallop, I'll repeat that same process where I fill in the outside section with those fun swirls, remembering to always leave myself an out so I can get back in. Also alternating directions when I'm quilting the swirls. From there, I'll go back and add that small echo on the inside of the smallest scallop on the bottom of the block, then stitch in the ditch and move on to the next. I'll repeat that process all the way across the border section that fits in my throat space. Once I finish stitching all of those scallops, the fun fillers all the way on the inside, then I'm going to go to the outside and start adding those fun straight lines. So with this particular design, I'm going with 1/2 inch space lines. I started at the bottom most point that my throat space will allow me, and I'm working across the block. So I stitch my first line. Now, how do I know that my ruler is lined up straight? On the ends of the 4-in-1 machine quilting ruler, you can see some marked straight lines. I'll line one of those lines up with the border to ensure that the straight lines that I'm going to stitch are straight, that they're not going at some funny angle. So I'll stitch a straight line across the block, then I'll travel up the ditch, or if I'm near the scallop, I'll just travel along my previously stitched line. Now, because I am using a really fine thread, I'm using the So Fine thread here. Now I am using high contrast thread here just so that you can see it a little more. I'm using the white thread on a green border. If this were an actual quilt, what I was quilting this design on, then I would switch and use green thread. And in the points where I do stitch over my previous thread, it won't look as thready as it does seem to appear here. But even though I am using a contrasting thread color and stitching over my previous stitch line a few times, because I'm using the really fine So Fine thread, it really doesn't even stand out and overall still looks really fabulous. When I get up to my top corners, or all of the corners on this design, you'll notice that I've marked a 45-degree angle. So with a design like this, especially with that scallop, I do want to make sure my corner is mitered. The machine quilting appears as if it's mitered. So you'll notice that I'll stitch a straight line to that diagonal marked line and then alternate directions and repeat that process until I get all the way out to the outside corner filled in with those nice 1/2 inch space lines. Once I've done that, then I'll continue on stitching those straight lines all the way across this border design. And a couple of images of this super fun border design. I love this one. I hope you are all able to find a little bit of inspiration from this super cute border design.